അവിടുന്ന് വൈകുന്നേരം പെട്ടെന്ന് എന്നെ അവർ മാനസികമായിട്ടുള്ള
Hey everyone, on this episode of Noon, I'm delighted to introduce you to Austin, an incredible individual who's left a significant mark in the world of emergency medical services. His journey is one of dedication and passion to the teaching of other professionals. Austin's career began as a math teacher, where he quickly figured out that was not the audience he wanted to teach. So he went back to school to become an EMT, where he progressed to become a highly skilled flight paramedic. While he is proud to say that he's currently retired from the field, his influence continues to shine through his work as a clinical educator for EMS professionals. Austin is also the host of the Coffee Break Hems podcast, where he shares his wealth of knowledge and experience with a wide audience. His podcast serves as a testament to his commitment to education and the EMS community. Join us for this engaging conversation as Austin discusses what has shaped him into the remarkable individual he is today. This episode promises to provide a unique perspective on EMS, the power of education, and the impact one can make on a field even after retirement. Let's get started. Welcome, Austin, to the Noon podcast. I appreciate you coming out so much. Thank you for coming on such short notice to it. I'm a fan of yours. I listen to your podcast, and we'll introduce it a little bit later. But how are you doing today?
Yeah, super good. Yeah, just enjoying a kind of a relaxing afternoon. Had some nice lunch and a beer with my wife today, which doesn't happen very often.
That's awesome. And I really I know people can't see it, but I love the view. I'm watching the squirrels run up and down the trees behind you, which is super cool. Where are you located at?
I'm in like far northern California, kind of in a valley, but we're a valley surrounded by lakes. So it's yeah, I mean it's
Ooh.
beautiful in this area. I don't want to say the name because I don't want
No.
people to start moving here.
And I mean, looking through the window, it looks beautiful. And the farthest north that I've traveled was Chico, California, and I absolutely loved Chico, California. It was
Yeah.
beautiful up there.
No, Chico's beautiful. I actually that one of my training centers is in Chico. I love teaching over there because yeah, it's super nice and go take some lunch at Bidwell Park. It's a beautiful area for sure.
That's awesome. So can I go ahead and get an introduction of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Austin. I've been a paramedic since 2010. I started working in EMS in 2008 as an EMR, kind of accidentally anyway. I first went to college to be a math teacher. And so started working in the math lab at the college and very quickly realized that I hate teaching people that weren't already good at math, which probably was not going to make me a very effective math teacher. So my first semester of college, I actually had 11 units and I needed 12 in order to be full time. And I found this first responder class and was like, oh, that's cute. It's like a first aid class. That's one unit. I'll take that. And then I became a paramedic like 3 years later.
Oh, and
that's
that just happens that way,
yeah, that's how I accidented into EMS. Yeah, but worked the ground for 7 or 8 years like most people do, and then moved into flight. Started flying back in late 14, early 15. So did it for almost 10 years, but I'm happy to say I'm essentially retired from EMS nowadays, just a entrepreneur and a teacher. Growing a very fortunately successful business that started in my living room about 12 years ago.
that is so awesome. And I think that's kind of the dream for most EMS people, right? You either go into teaching or you stay in the field until you literally can't stay in the field anymore.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think most of us paramedics, we do have some sort of side hustle at some point.
Yes.
And, I think a very common thread with paramedics is we certainly don't like sitting still and or being alone for that matter. So between my American Heart Association little side hustle and writing books and doing podcasts, it has kept me busy, and I've been very fortunate that most of my little projects turned out to be pretty successful. So
It sounds like it. And I did happen to visit your website, which looks very professional.
thank you. Yeah, I made it on Wix in 2015, and I without any hyperbole, I think that I've probably spent 10,000 hours on that stupid website, failing at it and failing at it until I finally figured out how to do it all.
It's not easy, right? And we were just talking about how much we have to YouTube things to
Yeah.
learn how to use them or figure them out these days.
Yep. You can build a website and build a house by watching YouTube videos. That's for sure.
Yes, there are a lot. You can do any medical thing watching YouTube these days.
I know people actually ask me all the time just for my web, or my podcast. They'll reach out and ask me like how I learn all of this information. And granted, I do read a ton of journals and look at a lot of studies and read the literature and stuff like that. But I very unabashedly tell people that a lot of what I've learned in medicine I learned on YouTube.
I don't see anything wrong with that. So
Yeah.
speaking of your podcast, what's the title of your podcast?
It's the Coffee Break HEMS podcast. HEMS like helicopter EMS. Started it about 3 or 4 years ago now, right at the beginning of COVID, when I was serving as an educator for my flight program. I couldn't travel anymore because of all the travel restrictions. So I needed to find some way to be able to teach my local branches, and so started the podcast and was very, very surprised that at the end of season one, we had listeners in all 50 states and about 38 countries, and getting thousands and thousands of downloads every episode. And so it kind of turned into a thing that I decided to do. But I've been working on my second book, actually, that's almost done. And so I've taken a little hiatus from my podcast. I haven't released an episode in like 6 months or something like that.
Oh, shame on you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's hard to work for free.
I
But
agree.
yeah. Podcasting's all good, all fun and games, but it takes a lot of work on the back end to release these episodes, as I'm sure you are very well aware. And
Yes.
so, I do have a passion for it for sure. And I love education and I love releasing the podcast. I get a lot of satisfaction from it, or personal fulfillment from it. But at the end of the day, I do have to feed my family. And my wife and I have 6 children. And so it's
Oh,
in Northern California. So it's
you're
expensive.
you're building that football team, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Six and done, as I always say.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
6 and done.
yeah. We finally figured out what kept causing it.
That is great, dude. That's great. So one of my buddies had actually suggested that I listen to. He just started Rotor within the last year, and he was like, "You've got to listen to this episode." And he said, "And then you have to interview him because he sounds fantastic." And I was like, "Cool. You know what? I'll listen to the episode." And the episode was called, I believe it was called "My First Clean Kill."
Oh yes, yeah. We've probably had about 100,000 people listen to that episode. It's
What a
definitely.
powerful episode, man. What a powerful episode. So what prompted you to even record that?
I think that I over the years, you see so many providers that have this like profound level of hubris, and they're very quick to judge and they're very quick to hate on people when they see them doing something that they don't understand. And one example is this was a few years ago. One of our crews had showed up to a scene of this nasty, gnarly trauma, and our crews carry blood on every flight, so they're transfusing the patient, but they needed to take this guy's airway, and so they're doing it properly. In my mind, I'm very passionate about airway management. That's actually what my second book is about, and the ground crews started to kind of flip out and were like, we could have been in the hospital by now and yada, yada, yada. And because they had just gotten to the point in their careers where they just didn't understand that there were things that they didn't know. And that's such a dangerous place to be, that you can get into this place of like complacency and to being so sure that you're right about everything, that you can like kill people. And so I was thinking about a way to talk about complacency and to talk about how to motivate people to learn and to continue to get better in their field. And I was like, well, I can't sit here from a place of judgment. I think the best way to do it is to tell people that I've murked people at the same time. And, and a lot of people think that I'm a quote unquote expert in a few fields or a few little micro pieces of medicine. And you'll find largely universally that when you talk to anybody who's kind of an expert in the field, it's because we accidentally murdered somebody while trying that intervention, and it created a drive that fueled that fire to be able to become an expert in that thing. So that was my motivation behind that episode for sure.
Yeah, that was definitely a really powerful episode. It makes you kind of like think back on if you've been in the field for a long time, kind of makes you think back on your career and
Yeah.
wonder, how many of those were something that you could have prevented. I mean, and I know you said you've been in EMS for a long time. I've been in EMS for a long time. There's a lot that I probably don't remember.
Yep. Yeah, no, 100%. I feel that more and more every single day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what got you started on the podcast in the first place?
It was really just that. It was when COVID started. I didn't have the ability to travel around anymore, so I just needed a mechanism to be able to teach the classes that I felt that were important. So you'll really see if you look back to the very early episodes of my podcast, they are very largely geared toward helicopter or flight EMS. They are not basic topics, and it's really because I was responsible at that time for doing CQI for 100% of the flights that came through our entire California program. So I read a lot of charts, and I
Mm-hmm.
would see these charts where I was like, man, they just fumbled through that one. They didn't really know which direction to go, with this specific piece of equipment, be it BiPAP or whatever it was. And so those early episodes were all targeted toward them. But when I started to see that I was not getting 30 listens an episode, but was getting, 3 or 4 thousand an episode, I was like, well, clearly this is not just air medical people that are listening anymore, because there's only like 10,000 of us in the entire country. And so I just started to reach out on social media, and I was like, who's listening to this podcast? And it was a ton of paramedic students, which is amazing. I mean, and firefighters and a bunch of other types of people. But I used to tell all those paramedic students that would reach out to me, and they're like, how do I get to the place where you are? And I'm like, dude, the fact that you are listening to a medical podcast while in paramedic school, and you have a firm grasp understanding that the stuff you're learning in your class right now is just the beginning of what you need to know
Mm-hmm.
to be effective, tells me that you're going to be a much better paramedic than I ever was, because you do not have the same cockiness that I definitely had when I was 20 years old going through a medic program.
That's fantastic advice. And so true, right? I I was pretty similar in that. I paramedic was kind of always easy. Taking the
Yeah.
tests was easy, and I don't mean it in a bad way. I just mean like it was very natural for me. So I didn't feel like in paramedic school I had to really go much further than I did until I got out of paramedic school. And now, as a flight paramedic, I'm like, oh, there's still days, that I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
What do
No.
I need to do to fix this? Right. So it's just a constant. And I try and teach that myself. Like, don't become complacent. You need to be learning something every day. If not something, you need to be, specializing in one thing every day, because it can get so scary sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely I live in medicine by a mantra, but I'll save it for the end. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, this little sentence is definitely something that I've told myself many, many, many times. But I'll leave us with that at the
We'll
very end.
save it. Okay.
Yeah.
So, out of all of the positions, the many hats that you've worn in your EMS career and math hat career, what so far has been just your absolute favorite?
Oh gosh, my favorite. I mean, flying was my favorite thing. I definitely, um, the podcast was amazing, and I have a deep love for teaching. Even simple classes like BLS classes, which this year I'll teach right around 400 BLS classes up in this area.
Wow.
And so, it's like watching the same movie every day of your life.
Hmm.
But I have a deep passion for it. You can tell when you've really rocked a class and you've made the class laugh and they've walked away knowing that they actually learned something new for the first time, and they've been taking this class for the last 15, 16 years. And they walk out of there and they're like, I actually learned something new today. It's almost like the way that any stage performer would feel when they really like crush the audience and they walk out of there with that high, and they're like, dude, nothing can screw up this good mood that I now have today. So I mean,
Yes.
I have a deep passion for that. But I mean, flying is definitely the highlight of the career. Just the scope of practice and level of independence that you have and the level of trust that the providers have in you to make the right decisions. And you can have, I think, a much more lasting effect on the outcome of patients when you aren't operating with a hand and a foot tied behind your back.
Yes, I agree. Flying and the critical care aspects of flying are 100% so much funner and so much
Yes.
more enriching than a ground. And it's not to take away from ground because a lot of people love doing ground.
Yeah. No, I mean, and there were, ground has its moments that are wonderful and amazing. But the thing that I actually would say about flight is that one of the things that hurts your soul in ground EMS is the constant dealing with the lowest echelons of society. And I don't say that in like a mean spirited way, but when you walk into what maybe used to be a house back before it was destroyed, and then people continue to occupy that building for another 20 years, and you walk in and they are in their environment, they're in their clothing and their environment, and you're looking at them and you're like, God, like today is the worst day of your life, but tomorrow will also be the worst day of your life, and so on and so forth. And you have to deal with that in ground EMS every day, and it hurts your soul, and it makes you, start to almost assume that people are kind of dirtbags until proven otherwise. And,
Yes.
and it's easy to fall into that trap. But in flight medicine, you don't do that anymore. You get all the sick patients that are what you thrive to get, and you're still treating the same people, but you're not treating them in their environment anymore. Oftentimes they're in a hospital bed in a gown with a horrendous diagnosis, and you just get to play with the medicine, and you don't have to deal with all those environmental things. You don't have to see the things anymore. And so I think that mental health in flight is so much easier to maintain than it is on the ground. And that's one of the big things too that I love about flight.
I agree 100%. But do you have any suggestions, maybe to make it a little easier for those ground folks that prefer to stay in ground?
Yeah, it's not your fault.
Oh,
It's
oh, that touched my soul.
yeah, it's not your fault. It's it's only your fault if you don't take the time to become an expert in every possible scenario. If you prep for a call when you get toned out, uh, you're gonna feel like dog shit after the call, right? And so, my thoughts on how to combat the soul crushing nature of EMS is actually how I feel about PTSD in EMS. Like in my mind, because I see it like every single day. So I've developed this kind of like working theory for like what the two primary causes are of PTSD and just getting your soul sucked out of your body in EMS. And the first that I would love to talk about is that you completely lose your sense of self, which is an incredibly easy thing to do. And I'll expand on that and what that means.
Okay.
Um, and then the second is that you have a feeling of helplessness when you don't know exactly how to do the next thing that should be done. And both of those are controllable factors. And at the end of the day, both of them are your fault if you don't do something about it.
Right.
And so, with the second thing, which is the easier thing to fix, the complete the feeling of unsureness or helplessness in how to treat a patient, is that if you're not actively on a 911 call and you're at work, you should be studying and you should be doing things every single day. Because why do we not deal in air medical with as many bad memories as we do in ground EMS? It's because in the air medical world, we train every day. It's not only a part of the culture, I mean, it's a part of the rules, right? CAMES tells us that we must learn these things and we must show competency in these things. And so when you spend time thinking through the logistics of doing every small little thing that you possibly can in every little situation, when it comes to, pediatrics or high risk obstetrics or neonatal medicine or whatever topic you hate, if you become an expert in that thing, the 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 demons seem to go away. Because if you do everything correctly and there's no doubt in your mind that nothing else could have been done, no change could have been affected by a different action of yours, that shit won't wear on your soul. It doesn't, right? Because you don't have this feeling of helplessness. You don't have this unsureness about your actions anymore. And so I feel like if you spend the time to educate yourself, a lot of those demons start to go away. Hopefully that makes sense. And it wasn't the
Yes,
rant.
it did. It did make sense to me.
But the other thing that I think is actually incredibly important is maintaining a very active sense of self, right? So before you got into EMS, and if you can remember back that far,
Mm.
but before you got into EMS, like who made you you? Like what were the things that identified you as like this is who I am, Sam, as a person?
That's a huge question.
Sure.
I feel like
Yeah.
that's a loaded question too, but
Sure.
uh that's so funny.
It's a it's
my
a
father,
hard question.
it is a very hard question. My father was a police officer, and I think that I based a lot of my actions and attitudes off of who he was.
Hmm.
Bear in mind that I also got into EMS very young at the age of 18.
Yep. Me too. Yeah, which it's hard when it shapes you into an adulthood. But if you
Yes.
ask somebody who's not in the medical field, like at all, and you say, what are the things that people would say about you in terms of like, who you are in your community? And most people would say your family, your religion, your hobbies, the school program you go to, and a number of other small things, right? Who you volunteer with in the community, the teams you're coaching, whatever it is. But when you get into EMS, what's the cardinal sin that every single baby EMS person commits? It's that they work 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Not only do they work 7 days a week, but they're working shift work. So you have this inability to do any of the other things because you always work on Sundays. So you're definitely not going to church. You work 7 days a week. So you don't see your family anymore. And when you do, you're exhausted. You work every day, so you definitely do not have time to finish that woodshop project. And you used to do woodshop stuff every day. You are too busy to go back to school. So if school was part of your sense of self, that's not it anymore because you don't have any time for that. And so you only have this one final piece of that puzzle that makes you who you are, and that's your job because it's the only thing that you have time for now.
Hmm.
And so that's why you talk to any paramedic and you say, like, hey, who are you? They say, my name's Austin. I'm a paramedic, right? Because that's the only thing that you are. That's
Yeah.
the only thing that gives you a sense of self. And if that's the only thing that you are, and that's the most important part of your life, that shit'll weigh on your soul because everything that happens in that job that you do not have an immediate span of control over is going to hurt you. And that's also why we have a lot of people in EMS that get pissed when changes happen at the company. right? If there's a medication that gets switched to a different concentration,
Yeah.
we get infuriated. And we're like, where did this crazy like sense of entitlement come from that I got so angry that we switched to a different piece of equipment that's actually better than the last one we used to use? And it's because I didn't have a say in the decision. And this job is the only thing that gives me a sense of self. And so I will get angry with change
Yeah.
because we need to maintain a span of control over our lives. So I think that if people stop working all those damn overtime shifts, make an absolute effort to do the things that are not EMS related that make you happy, like your hobbies or your church or going to school or spending time with your family and children. It needs to be something, right? EMS at the end of the day should be the least important aspect of your life. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be an absolute expert in every possible, you know, little sub piece of medicine, because you should if you want to be effective at what you do. But when you're not at work, dude, you should be doing other things to create a sense of self. Um, I think that those two things, though, together would help to combat a lot of the badness that we see in ground EMS.
And that, I mean, I'm not going to lie, what you just said was very, very profound. And maybe that comes from somebody who worked those 7 days a week for several, several years. But that can also work for like ER nurses. You know what I
Oh,
mean? That's like they who just throw themselves into their work. You know, they do. The ICU nurses, all the people that are, trying to be bigger and better at what they do,
mm-hmm.
that can
Yeah.
go into anything. So let me reverse that and ask who you are.
I'm a father and a husband first. I'm a teacher. I use woodshop as an example because I'm an avid
I
woodworker.
figured.
Yeah, you can, but everything in this house I've essentially built, including that big tree house you can see out there behind me.
It's amazing.
Um, a tree chalet, if you will. But and I'm a friend, and I'm a skier, and I'm an avid fisherman. And yeah, I mean, there's so many, and I'm a Catholic. There's so many things that I think give me a sense of purpose more so than my career, because at the end of the day, you will eventually have to leave this field.
Yeah.
And if you're left with the shell of what a relationship once was, and you didn't spend any time with your kids and they can't stand you because they don't know you, uh, that's not a good place to be, right? That's really not a good place to be. So who was I 10 years ago? I, I was that person 10 years ago.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I worked 9 days a week and I had nothing. And when we switched to a new IV pump, I was the first one to be pissed about it. And it was actually a mixture of a talk that I heard and then a book that I read called Emotional Survival. It's actually a law enforcement book that I made, kind of made all these realizations. And I think that the thing that helped me realize that I needed to prioritize work less and I needed to stop picking up overtime and just live within my means at that time was understanding the concept of hypervigilance in that book Emotional Survival and Law Enforcement. Not sure if you're terribly familiar with the term or not,
Yes.
because a lot of people in our industry don't. And ER nurses, paramedics, firefighters, EMTs, we're all the same. And that our jobs are like a drug to us, right? You have this, and it doesn't matter if you're running calls all day on a 24-hour shift or not, right? Because when that alarm goes off and you are heading into work, in your mind, even if you're not thinking that you're thinking this, in your mind, you're preparing for a bad day, right? You're preparing for a stand up 24 where you're getting your butt kicked all day and the calls are all gnarly calls. And so your epinephrine levels and your dopamine levels and your cortisol levels, they are hiked up in your body. And you're in this hyper vigilant state, even if you don't know it, right? Your heart rate's not necessarily elevated, but you're in a hyper vigilant stress state. That also makes you feel pretty freaking good, though, right?
Yeah.
You feel pretty good. And not only do you feel good, but you also look pretty good too when you do it, when you're in that state, right? Your pupils are about a millimeter bigger than they otherwise would be. Your cheeks have a little bit more color in them. Your brain is functioning at 100% available capacity. So you're witty. You can make decisions very quickly. And so, I mean, this hypervigilant state is obviously incredibly necessary for us to be effective clinicians in the field, which is also why we meet most of our spouses at work when we work in ED medicine, right? I am married
Yeah.
to an emergency department nurse. And I would say that I am a cliche of a paramedic, right? I'm married to an ED nurse, a little, 120-pound blonde ED nurse. But yes, I am a basic bitch paramedic, that's for sure. But we're in this crazy hypervigilant state, and so we're witty and we're attractive and we're sexier than we otherwise would be. And then we go home, and you have to pay that piper, right? So
Yeah.
for every 1 minute that you have elevated cortisol and dopamine levels, you spend a minute in the trough. You have to spend a minute paying that piper. But when you work 12-hour shifts, then you go home for 12 hours. And that entire 12-hour period of time that you're at home, you're at a deficit, and you don't start to pick back up to normal levels until you are on the car ride back to work again. And so if you spend 7 days a week working, you never feel good at home, which is also why all you want to do when you get home is sit in front of a TV. You don't give a crap what's on the TV, right? You just want to zone out, and you don't want to make decisions. And when your spouse comes up to you and is like, hey, sweetie, how was your day at work today? What do you want to do for dinner? The last thing you want to do on this planet is make the decision of what you would like to have for dinner. Right.
Yes.
Which is why those arguments happen in the driveway. You're pulling
Yeah.
out, you're like, what do you want? I don't care. What do you want? I don't care. Seriously, pick something. What do you want? And so you're easily irritable, and you're completely indecisive. And so, if you work less, spend less time in that hypervigilant state, spend more time with the people that matter most, spend more time doing your hobbies, you can regain that sense of self. And the inevitable part is that you are going to have to work a little bit, at least your full-time hours minimum. And so if you want to have an enjoyable home life, you need to prepare for your home life while you're at work, right? Because I can guarantee you that conversation in the driveway that ended up with you guys yelling at each other because nobody wanted to figure out what the hell to do for dinner, if you had taken the time at work when you're between calls and you're in your sexy, hypervigilant, witty state to immediately come up with some restaurant that you've been wanting to try, and then you get on their website and you look at their menu and you find something that your wife would like to eat, right? And you're not going to do it for her, but you're giving her the options. And you look at their drink menu and you're like, dude, I know she'd be all over that. And so then when you get home and you're on autopilot and you're indecisive, that conversation in the driveway looks way different,
Yeah.
right? You're like, oh yeah, no, what do I want for dinner? Oh, I was actually thinking about going to Vintage. I actually looked at their website menu earlier today, and I found this crispy chicken salad that I think you'd be all over, with a little bit of pasta on the side, and then they've got this drink that you like, because not only are you going to not have to have those conversations anymore, but you're also probably going to get laid that night. which is
That's the entire goal.
which is the goal, right? That's the goal. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that wasn't too rambly, but
No, not at all.
I've taken a lot of time to think about these things over the years, and all the things that I did incorrectly in the beginning of my career. And if I could do it all over again, I would have done those things very differently for sure.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. And I know you haven't listened to a lot of the episodes, but we actually do talk about hypervigilance quite a bit.
That's awesome.
We also talk about emotional intelligence, and you have a very high level of emotional intelligence, which is nice. And I don't mind it if you ramble, because what you're saying does make sense, and it's very smartly put, which is nice. So you talked about if you could do it all over again, you would. But do you have any other big regrets in your life that you would change?
Yeah, I think that when you're younger and you're getting into EMS and you don't have the energy to have conversations. Um, the easiest thing for you to do is to argue for the intent to hurt, so you can get away from the conversation and go back to being a slug, right? Because you don't want to invest the time. If you want your life to be happy and you want to feel fulfilled and you want people to see you in the same way that you see yourself, you have to take the time to speak to people for the sake of understanding what they're saying and not speak for the sake of escaping the conversation. I think that that's probably the biggest thing that I regret is when I was 23, 24 years old. I think if you polled about 90% of the people at my ground agency and said, if you had to explain Austin Kaiser in one word, what would it be? I guarantee you 90% of them would have said asshole. And and I would love to redo that for sure. It's taken a lot of years to rectify some of those hurts that I have definitely said in the moment when I'm tired and pissed and I don't want to, I just don't want to talk. So yeah, I would definitely redo that 100%.
You're definitely talking to the soul, and you can tell you're definitely talking from the soul, and it's very refreshing. While we're on that topic, do you have any and I know you probably talked about it in your podcast, but do you have any big mistakes, or anything embarrassing that you would want to share with other people so that they maybe don't
Yeah.
also have those problems?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say like really embarrassing stories or anything like that, but I have talked about it in my podcast, some of my biggest failures, I suppose you could say. And they really all, they really all lead back to just a lack of understanding exactly what I was doing. And because in paramedicine, it's actually really an unfortunate part of EMS education that you gain a lot of confidence when you're in medic school, like a lot of confidence, right? And it's kind of a vicious cycle that happens when you become an EMT as well. Because when you become an EMT, you get out of school and you kind of think you know some things, right? You're very confident about what you know. And it's really not until you get on a box and you're driving the medic around and you get to those first few like critical sick calls or a kid call that you realize like, oh my God, like I actually kind of don't know shit. That's a hard realization to have. But then you get into medic school and then for some reason you fall into that same trap, and maybe it's different at different medic schools around the country. But I know in my medic program, like I came out of that real confident about my abilities.
Yeah.
Uh, but also at that time, which granted was a long time ago, and it could be very different in medic programs today, but at the time, it was not really talked about that like when you graduate this program, you know about a fifth grade level of EMS. We need you to get to a 12th grade level of EMS, but you have
Yeah.
to do that on your own. We can't teach you that. You have to gain experiences and you have to study on your own and become an expert in all of these things. But yeah, they didn't tell me that I was graduating with a fifth grade reading level when I when I graduated medic school. And so on the podcast, I talk about a couple calls in particular. One was an error of omission, which I think is actually the most common type of fatal error in EMS. That they're not actively making a medication error or having an unrecognized esophageal intubation or something. It's oftentimes that you have a patient that has some sort of presentation that you just don't know what the hell it is, and so instead of making a phone call and trying to ask for help or at least doing something that is a treatment pathway for something similar that you have in your kind of injury script vault in the back of your mind, uh, we tend to freeze and just use a little vitamin D, a little diesel to get him to the hospital as quickly as possible, and then the patient dies. And so, I have a couple examples on the podcast. One in particular was an elderly woman who had some funky rhythm that I had no idea what it was, and instead of doing something, I just froze. And interestingly enough, if I would have fallen back on, even like ACLS at the time, and when her blood pressure started to become garbage, I could have just gone to like a cardioversion on this patient who, as it turns out, had atrial fibrillation with WPW, which was a rhythm that I just didn't know back then. And so I didn't recognize it. I didn't know what it was. But if I had fallen back on kind of my at least baseline training, I probably would have saved that woman's life. But I just had no idea what it was, and I froze. And and I was terribly ashamed at the time that I froze. But I think my immediate defense mechanism was like, she was just super sick. I couldn't do anything. There was nothing to be done. And so it really wasn't until years later that I kind of came to that nightmarish wake up that, like, oh my God, I murdered that person. I
Yeah.
that was a true error of omission, and that's still murder in medicine anyway. So, I don't know that I have a ton of prime examples anymore. I've probably re-blocked those out of my memory since I did those podcast episodes.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Yeah.
That actually was a great example. And so it kind of brings up another topic. I'm sure you remember because you've been teaching for a while, but if you recall, in our older ACLS classes, they used to have like all of the strips that you had to memorize,
Yeah.
right? And recently they've gone to, well, if it's fast and narrow, you do this. If it's
Mhm.
fast and wide, you do this, right? So they take out a lot of that options.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's probably why they do that, right? They want to help you from if you're going to freeze because you don't recognize exactly what it is, do this.
Yes. Yeah. I think that there's a lot of that in medicine in general, though, and I don't want to necessarily call it catering to the lowest common denominator.
No, definitely not.
But I think what it is, yeah, LOL. I think what it is the American Heart Association needs to make this as simple as possible because the vast majority of people in medicine are new under 5 years. It is impossible for you to have a certain level of expertise in medicine today because everybody's new. And so they have to make it as simple as possible. And what they do is they look at these algorithms and they say, okay, what rhythms are not accounted for in this algorithm? All right, there's two of them, or there's three of them rather. And like we'll say the tachycardia algorithm. What percentage of patients of total all comers are presenting in one of those three rhythms? Oh, it's only 4%. Okay, so if you're saying that if you blindly follow this checklist without actually using your brain, you'll save 96% of your patients. Those are pretty good odds. That is an acceptable level of failure, right? An
Yes.
acceptable loss that we're willing to take. 4% of patients potentially die from using this algorithm. That's pretty good. Uh, and so there is a good part to that it makes it simple enough for basically anybody to follow, but it also makes it to where, yeah, you're going to probably murk about 4% of those patients. And, you're specifically talking about things like toxicological problems and AFib with WPW and those types of rhythms like that, where it's like, yeah, you don't see those every day. But when you do see it, you'll kill that person to
Yeah.
death if you follow that algorithm.
Hopefully you'll recognize, but if not, then
Yes. Yeah.
follow your local protocol, right?
Yeah. Love that boilerplate statement.
So I know you talked a little bit about how you about PTSD specifically and how you feel like education would kind of help relieve a lot of those symptoms. But do you have any PTSD from, working on the ground or working in flight that you still deal with?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's real for sure. Anybody anybody who still rolls around with the mentality of like, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. They're just a pile of shit. I mean, those old timers need to go away in my mind. Uh, I see that kind of stuff every day, and I feel it every day. I interestingly enough, I think that most of the dark places that you can go into, most of the recurring memories that you can accidentally fall into when you're driving by yourself, or when you're sitting on a couch late at night and everybody else in the house has gone to bed. Those are, first of all, those are dangerous places to be. If you're struggling, don't find yourself in those places.
Yes,
But
they are.
yeah, don't be alone on a couch somewhere, and don't be driving alone. But I think that most of those things actually affected me like much later, much way after those calls happened. One call in particular didn't, well, two calls in particular, I would say unifyingly are, two of my worst memories in EMS, but they definitely like didn't affect me in the moment, and they seem to affect a lot of other people in the moment. They affected me much later on. But interestingly, I would say that overall, the people who were, affected in the moment and emotional about it in the moment are probably a lot better off than I am, or than I was anyway. Because I definitely had a tendency in EMS to not view patients as people, right? And that's my defense mechanism.
Hmm.
And judge me for it or not, but
No judging.
but I, yeah, but I don't think of, and I say I don't, but I tend to feel a little differently now. But for a long time in EMS, I didn't think about patients as human beings, right? It was just a meat sack with vital signs. It was like playing a video game, and the video game had some shitty vital signs, and I needed to make those vital signs a little bit better. And so, that was the way that you combat it. But I think that stuff years later, you start to attach faces to those vital signs, and it starts to hurt you a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, I think that in typical, I guess bravado fashion, I wouldn't say that I would classify myself as having PTSD, in maybe a clinical sense anyway, of having recurring dreams, and struggling potentially with some depression, or withdrawal from friends and family. But I mean, I definitely get nervous every single time I back out of my driveway, when I know that my children were in the front yard. I definitely will go places all of a sudden in my mind when I hear somebody say a specific sentence or word, and all of a sudden I'll zip back to some place that I was standing in 10 or 12 or 15 years earlier, and then I have to like pop myself back out of it and be like, what the like, don't go there, don't go to that place, we're here right now. And so I don't know if that's common or not.
Hmm.
I actually don't, and really haven't spoken about this topic with anybody. You're actually the first person really ever that I've had any type of conversation about post-traumatic stress.
Well, then I'm honored. I actually, believe it or not, that is a fairly common thing. And I think that's common everywhere, not just in EMS, but um,
Yeah.
it's PTSD can affect so many people in so many different ways. And the way that you talk about it actually brings up a good point, too, because there's your common PTSD, right, where you're having those flashbacks and you're having those memories. But then there's so many other forms of PTSD, like you're talking about, with it could just be a lack of education, and like just you talking about it is taking me back to calls where like I didn't recognize something because I didn't understand it, and I wonder how that affected that patient. I mean, ultimately we got him to the hospital, but could there or could there have been a different outcome if I had done something? And it definitely takes you back to thinking about that. And it's not the first time I've thought about it, but you bringing light to that aspect of it definitely makes me think about it. Do you feel comfortable sharing your stories?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my when I was preparing for this episode, I actually, it's it's really funny. In the kind of interview format, you had looked at or presented me with two questions, right? What are your fondest memories of EMS, and what are your worst memories of EMS? And I had to whittle down the worst memories list to two, right?
Yeah, no,
But
for sure.
you could come up with a bunch of them. But without exaggeration at all, I sat in my office for 30 minutes silently thinking about my two best memories or my two fondest memories. It was hard to do. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what the hell? I know I've had a great time in my career. I've had so many good times where I'm laughing harder than I've ever laughed in my entire life. And I'm building these trauma bonded relationships with my peers, and some of my best friends in the world are paramedics. And but you can't, it was hard for me to think about those ones for some reason. I couldn't find those stories anymore. But yeah, I was like, what's your worst memory at EMS? I was like, boop 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 boop.
Yeah.
I just started rattling them off. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that that's almost a form of PTSD, right? Like you can recall them way faster. And I think, it actually really, I'm going to bring it up since we're talking about it. It really is amazing how many people say, I put all of those stories in a box.
Oh yeah.
I could not recall any of that. But if you're not on a podcast and you're not being recorded and I'm sitting next to you and we're sharing stories, we will be on the floor rolling laughing with just the stupid shit that people do. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like,
Yes,
and it's,
yes.
you put people on the spot and they're like, "Oh, nope, I don't remember, I can't recall." And it's just so funny because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it
No,
it's
you're
great
spot on.
though. It's great. I have a blast every time I do this. And I try to prepare some people, and some people it's like, I know we're going to have a good time. It doesn't matter if I send them the sheet or not. Like,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I appreciated my little sheet so I can make a bunch of notes all over it, which is how I did all of my podcasts. They weren't read from a script. I used to just draw a bunch of pictures, and then I would like explain the pictures as I was recording the podcast.
That's
But
fantastic.
yeah, I think that when I whittled down the list, the call that I, I would say I probably have not had, and I don't call a therapist for me, but I think that there probably has not been more than maybe a 2 or 3 day period in the last, 12 years that I haven't thought about this call, in some way. And oftentimes the thoughts are only, 1 second and it's gone. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I think about it a lot more. But I was a preceptor at the time. This is when I was on ground still, and I was precepting a paramedic. And back then, there's probably only six of us preceptors really in the county, and so we could kind of get the pick of the litter, if you will, from the paramedic program. Where I'm like, I'll take him first, and then I'll take her. And so you were kind of drafting your team that you were going to precept for the next 6 months. And so this was my second intern from that paramedic year, and he had maybe, 36. I mean, he was almost done. He had 3 or 4 shifts left and he was done at his 480. And we get toned out to a call for an auto versus pedestrian, but it was a residential address. And we didn't get really any information from that. And so we start cruising toward this call. It's a code 3 call. And we get about 2 minutes away. And at this point, my intern, should be running all the calls independently. And so I was not in a mind space of controlling a call or running a scene, right? This was his show. I was only going to step in if absolutely necessary. There's also at a point in my career when I didn't think about doing education for myself either, right? I was just in this kind of in the grind. I was in the rut of EMS of just doing the same thing every day. Didn't really care
Sure.
about my education that much. So we're about 2 minutes away, and we find out that the pedestrian is a 2-year old, and that the family has started CPR and in the driveway. And we're like, oh God. And all of our, that it got really, really quiet in that ambulance all of a sudden because we were all having a good time and joking and laughing and stoked that we were finally going to get some like a good patient and maybe this guy's kind of fucked up. And but that tone changed a lot when we realized he was a 2 year old. So my intern, though, I could see this terror on his face. And so I was like, hey, dude, I'll run this. You go ahead, you just back me up. So we get there. It's a 2 year old, was just in a diaper and didn't have any other clothing on. It was a very nice house. And the driveway was a really long hill up to this house, kind of on the hill. And the husband and wife had gotten into a fight. I mean, not a physical fight, just a yelling argument. But I guess it got pretty heated. So the dad got in their big black SUV and started backing down the driveway and ran his son over and killed him. And so we worked this kid in, on the driveway for quite some time, and I intubate him and do the things, and can't get pulses back, and I'm starting to assess him, and I see that his belly's getting bigger, and so I'm like, yeah, okay, he's got an intra-abdominal bleed. It might be a pelvic bleed, it might be a liver lac, who knows what it is, and then I assessed his head, and I hadn't realized up until that point, but his whole occiput that was crushed. He had just a
Mm.
massive basilar skull fracture. This child was dead forever. But through pressure at the scene from one of the supervisors that showed up for the ambulance organization, as well as the fire department, they were like, "We can't call this here. We have to transport to the hospital." And it's a 25-minute drive from this house to the hospital, where we continue to work on this kid, and then we get to the hospital, and and so at this point, I've had time to kind of. This child is 2. I also have a 2 year old son, and at that time, and I was definitely not in a good mind space, but I was keeping it together, and we get to the trauma bay at the hospital, and the hospital team starts to kind of take over, and the nurses are falling apart, which is making matters even worse. They're like bawling while they're doing CPR on this kid, which cry afterwards, please. But the dad gets to the hospital. Somebody drove him in, and we kind of lead him in. I actually met him at the ambulance bay doors, and he's just a wreck, and I didn't like, there was no like anger toward this guy that I felt. I just felt so awful for him. It was like so bad for this dude. And I led him into the trauma bay, and he like laid his eyes on his dead 2 year old son on that table, and he just collapsed. And it was too much for him to bear and witness, and he just collapsed and ended up just smacking his face on the floor super hard and busted his face open. And so he's now bleeding on the floor, and people are trying to get him up into a bed in trauma 2 while we're getting ready to call his son in trauma 1. And so unsuccessful pediatric resuscitation. And but afterwards, I spent that day kind of trying to like calm people down that were like, the firefighters were kind of losing it and crying, and my supervisor was bawling, and I was hugging him, and but the whole time I like, for some reason, had to be like the strong one in that scenario. And because I'm also taking care of my intern, who I've always had that kind of parental protection feeling over my interns,
Mm-hmm.
like nobody can yell at my interns but me. Don't talk to my intern, that's my intern. But so I'm trying to keep everybody together. And my intern actually lived with me at the time. He was
Mm.
renting a room in a spare bedroom in me and my wife's house at that time. So it wasn't like I could go home and continue to not be strong for this person. And so we went home, and all we said that night, we got home. My wife, I think, was working still, so it was just him and me in the house. And I poured myself some bourbon, poured some for him, and I'm kind of standing across the kitchen island from him, and I'm just like, you good? And he was like, yeah, I'm good. You good? And we're like, yep. And then we never talked about it again. And but that shit creeped up on me over the next few months, and I never really, processed it, never did anything. And but I'll tell you what, 12 or 13 years later, however long ago that was, I get nervous every single time I back out of a driveway to this day. Anytime one of my kids is outside, I get nervous about it. And, I like roll down the windows and, I'm like, go stand right there so I can see where you are. And while I back out of this driveway, and the kids all know, they know, like they don't get to be in the cul-de-sac when I'm backing out. They got to be on these steps so I can see them in front of me. And I definitely think about that, the dad actually, probably even more than the kid. I
Yeah.
see that loss, that how do you recover from something like that, knowing that you accidentally killed your own child, so yeah, that call
Yeah.
sucked. Yeah.
That one's definitely a heavy one, dude. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. That is rough. And I can tell in the way that you talk about it that it does still bother you.
Yeah, no, I no, it does for sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's probably a lot better process now. I mean, shit, 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have told you that call, right? That
Yeah.
that call is one that was going to remain buried for me. But yeah, I mean, it can take a long time to recover from those things. And I think that at the time, though, too, one of the compounding factors is that I just, I didn't have anybody to share that with, and I didn't have anybody to, anything else in my life that helped to deal with that, in terms of, whether it's your faith or your spouse or your friends, or or whatever it is. Like, if you don't water those relationships, that plant will die. And I think at that time in my career, I hadn't watered those plants in a long time.
Yeah.
So so I think I was stuck with that one for sure.
And one thing that you mentioned, and I just want to get your kind of opinion on, I kind of have an idea already, but you had talked about when it came to transporting that patient that there was some pressure, maybe just, in general on the scene. Was there pressure from your supervisor? Like, if your supervisor hadn't showed up, would you have made the decision to transport that child anyways?
No, I am 100% sure I would not have. Even at that time in my career, I thought that one of the cruelest things that you could do to somebody is give them a false sense of hope. And as soon as you load up into the back of that ambulance and you start heading to the magical place that is the emergency department, that family starts to think that that kid can come back to life, and you give them that false sense of hope, which is then just destroyed 35 minutes later when they finally call it. The pressure came when I turned to my supervisor and I said, "Hey, can you make base contact with Mercy? This kiddo's been in a systole for the last 30 plus minutes that we've been in this driveway, and we've done everything. We're out of medications. Not that epi give matters at all in trauma codes, but at that time we didn't know that.
Yeah.
um, but but no, the pressure started to come when I was requesting a termination of resuscitation. So um, I feel like actually one of the things that made it bear even harder on my soul was the family started to, they stopped grieving when I started to load that kid up in the back of the ambulance, and they started to get that hope that somehow he would be alive on the other end of this thing. And I felt super guilty knowing that that's not what's going to happen here. Like, that kid was gone. There was nothing that, I mean, God could not have brought that kid back to life. And So yeah, I mean, I definitely would have terminated the resuscitation for sure.
Yeah, no, that's been a topic of debate a couple of times too on a couple of other episodes, and I don't blame anybody who feels that there is a certain level of security in transporting a pediatric patient. If the family is super aggressive on the scene, honestly, it's just better to get out of there. But if you're in a
Yeah.
good place where you feel like you can terminate, I do honestly think that that's the best thing that you can do, both for that child and the family.
and for you as a provider.
Yeah.
You know, it's I there's we operate at a certain level of medicine that like those things cannot be corrected, right? And I mean, the ED is not going to do anything that you're not going to do, that you can't, have the capacity to be able to do. And so I do not want this to come out wrong, but I think that sometimes our our desire to run to the hospital in the absence of like a dangerous scenario or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find a more PC word than the word that's on the tip of my tongue here, but I think that there's a little cowardice in that, and that's like not the right word to use,
How
but
about comfort?
the
There's
comfort. There you
comfort
go.
in
There
it.
is.
Yes.
Yes, you are correct. Yeah. Um, but it's not going to do anybody any good. And I think in the long run, you having to work this thing for no reason, and it's completely useless to do what you're doing, for another 20 minutes, all it's going to do is make it that much harder for you to accept that later.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially in a situation where you have obvious signs of death already, right?
Yeah.
On the other side, though, we do have a lot of burnout, and people
Mhm.
might get to those codes and be like, "Eh, that person looks pretty toast to me. Like, let's just call it. Let's call medical control and just call this. I don't feel like working this code right now, you know." So there's
Yeah.
definitely both sides of that spectrum.
Yeah. The old burnout paramedic where they're like, they're 31. They had a good run. They're dead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. 31, that's a great age, right?
That's
Like,
a ripe old age in the 1860s. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Yeah, it's hard because you can't rubber stamp one thing and say say this is the one size fits all for all of EMS. That's very true. But I definitely think that when it comes to pediatric resuscitation, honestly, the worst thing you can do for the prognosis of a child is to scoop and run. That's not an opinion. I mean, that's a known fact. Like if
Yeah.
you have a pediatric cardiac arrest, the best possible thing you can do for that child is to stay where you are and work that thing right there, unless somebody's shooting at you. But fortunately for people like Dr. Peter Antevi over in Florida, we've got a lot of data to support that we should be sitting there doing everything that we should be doing and treating those kiddos the same way we treat adults, in the stay and play mindset instead of the scoop and run.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many. There's a lot of studies that go for that, and there's a lot of studies that say that we're taking too much time on scenes. You know what I mean?
Yep, yep. No, you're right. Yeah, no, it's easy to find literature to support your narrative. That's for sure.
Yes. Well said. Perfectly said.
Yes.
So, I'll give you the opportunity to talk about the second one if you would like to.
Yeah.
If not, we can move on to a happier subject. But it's up to you.
Sure. Yeah, this one, it's one of those weird sneaky ones where to me it wasn't a big deal. In the moment, it wasn't that big a deal, and then this one like slapped me in the face a couple years later. And there were a lot of contenders that made it real close to this list, but I think the reason that this one bothered me so much is because it didn't bother me, and then it really bothered me afterwards. Like 4 years later, it
Oh,
started to bug me, and um, because it really bothered my partner. My partner actually ended up taking like a stress leave after this call, and but it didn't bug me at all. But then I started thinking about it years later, um, which was just really weird. And but yeah, this actually was not a pediatric arrest. Thankfully, I've had my fair share, but this was not that.
sure.
But no, this second call, uh, we responded to a possible 1144, which I'm sure that's a universal 10 code that's used.
It is
1144
not.
is a
No.
dead guy. In California, that's what we call dead people. So yeah, but when you get toned down to an 1144, that means homie's dead, and you're probably not doing a resuscitation. This dude's been
Sure.
dead for a while. So yeah, getting an 1144 call is like getting a like, hey, there's a smell coming from that house call kind of thing. So so we're like, all right, maybe this one looks like a balloon, and
Gross.
so he hasn't quite popped yet, and which anybody who's a paramedic knows that. But weirdly enough, those are never some of our worst memories, right? Where we
No.
like we crack the door in the house and we're like, fuck, oh, we're like, hey guys, there's a dead one in here. Like those are never your worst calls, yeah, which is so interesting to me. Those calls were definitely the ones that let me know that if you have a cat and you die, that cat will start to eat your friggin' nose about 4 hours after death.
You can't be, dogs will too.
Dogs will too,
Dogs
100%.
will
Yeah.
too.
I feel like dogs wait just a little bit longer though.
I think it depends on the dog.
It's true,
Or
true.
maybe
Yeah.
like the breed of the dog.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah, dog. I've seen my fair share of doggies that run out of the house with a red snout. That's for sure.
Yes.
But no, this call though. So we responded to this possible 1144, and we get to the house, and the outside of the house looked really nice. Like it was a nice, kind of like the white painted stucco, house,
Mhm.
or the concrete siding, whatever they call it, and nice front lawn. And we walked in, and I was just like crushed with this horrendous nasty smell, but it wasn't like a rotting body smell. It was
Mm.
like it was like alcohol and like filth and trash and cat poop, and it was just this horrendous smell. And in the house, the floor of the house was completely covered in trash and paper plates. Like I didn't know if I was standing on carpet or hardwood floors, kind of thing. It was a
Yeah.
couple inches thick,
Ugh.
and which is not an unfamiliar sight if you work in EMS. We've all been in those hoarder houses, and on the countertops in the kitchen, it was there must have been 200 or 300 bottles of like White Wolf and Pop Off vodka, like the half-gallon plastic bottles of vodka. And this woman was on the couch, and the couch was all jacked up, like springs were poking out of this thing. And the woman is like hammered, right? She's basically unconscious, and we like wake her up, and she's just hammer slammered, had a vodka bottle in her lap, and we're like, who called 911? And she's like, oh, and she's like, my husband in the back. And she's so inebriated she can like barely speak. And so we turn the corner into this hallway to go try to find her mystery husband. And there's like a 2 year old, 2 or 3 year old in the hallway, and they're in a super dirty diaper, and they're covered in like feces,
Mhm.
but it wasn't human feces. And I know this because the kid was playing with a pile of cat shit in the hallway on the trash, right? And so,
Mm.
like, covering themselves with this cat shit. And
Mm.
so I turned to my partner and I'm like, get this kid out of this house right now. I'm going to go find the husband. And so I'm looking in rooms, and it's hard to get all the doors open in the rooms because there's so much trash on the other side of the door that you can't really get the door open very easily. So I look through a couple rooms and open a bathroom by mistake because I'm like, Jesus, like this, it's a porta potty that had been left out in the sun for too long.
Uh,
And so then I hear a rustling sound in this other room, and I go into the other room, and on the bed, almost kneeling as if he was in like prayer, kneeling on the side of the bed and then collapsed kind of onto the bed, was the husband. Very clearly dead, had been probably dead for quite some time. So dead, I didn't put him on the monitor. But a child was also in the room, a young child, probably, 3 or 4, something like that, young enough to not understand the concept of death. And this kid was climbing onto the bed, kind of sitting on his dad's like head and shoulders, and then sliding off of his dad, like using his dad's back as a slide and sliding onto the floor, and then climbing back up and using his dad's body as a slide again. So I grab that kid and we walk outside, and I'm like, and I think that there was just so much that happened in front of my eyeballs in that previous 2 minute period of time
Yes.
that I was like, didn't process any of that.
Yeah, you're like quickly shut that down. That
Yes. Yeah.
that
I was like,
was
copy that.
overwhelming
I'm
for me
putting that
just to
into a piece of my
listen.
brain. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, we get a hold of people, and I'm like, yeah, it's confirmed 11:44, but we need CPS in the sheriff's department here right now. And so we get CPS there. We're there for several hours. And I'm kind of coordinating things with like the sheriff's department, talking to them. I'm also helping to like subdue this wife who has all of a sudden woken up out of her stupor and is now kind of trying to fight us a little bit. And so I'm having to do a med clearance on this woman. And and then the coroner gets there and yada yada. I'm kind of coordinating that. But the whole time my partner was actually in the back of the ambulance and he was cleaning these kids off. And he was, taking gloves and making, little blow up
The balloons.
balloons with the gloves and drawing clowns on them and stuff and playing with these kids for a solid 2 hours that we were out of service at this house. And he looked fine. And then CPS finally kind of loaded the kids up. And as soon as they like got out of there, my partner just fell apart. And I mean, he fell apart. And this is I call this guy my partner. He's one of my favorite partners I've ever had, but he's called the Gorilla. He's a just big, 6'2" Samoan, probably, I mean, pushing 320, but
Yeah.
not a chunky monkey 320.
Like,
Like he's built like a brick shithouse 320,
yes.
and, with a little belly on him, but he could kill me with one hand, and while his legs are tied together. And so just this big massive guy just kind of fell apart. But I was just kind of like, like, yeah, there's a dead guy, and we got those 2 kids out of that shitty house, like, whatever. And so it wasn't until years later that all of a sudden, like, that call really bothered me, like years later, and I started to kind of relive the human body slide thing over and over in my head, and couldn't get that one out of my body for a little while. I definitely drank a lot when that goal started to bother me.
Yeah, that's a pretty fucked up story, bro. That's Jesus. That
Yeah.
was pretty bad. That man. I couldn't imagine, man. That's a tough one.
Yeah, yeah, that was not a good day for sure. Yeah, so
Yeah.
those are probably my 2 worst. So, I mean, they can only get better from there, I suppose.
This is very true. This is very true.
Not to
Ooh.
dampen the mood. I'm having horror stories listening or thinking about your listeners hearing that story and going like, Jesus Christ.
You're setting off everybody else's PTSD.
Right, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I guess we should say trigger warning in front of that
Oh,
story.
I
Yeah.
do. Don't worry.
Okay.
I trigger warning every episode.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh
No,
man, that's a rough one, dude. And I don't know if I would say I'm happy to say, but I'm pleased to say that, there are several providers that don't see anything that bad in their entire career, which is good.
yeah,
Some of us just have that little shit stamp on our foreheads that says you're going to see some fucked up shit. And
yeah,
then some of us don't.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I definitely like, I'm not going to tell this story. We're going to shift to happier days here in a second,
Yeah.
but no, I mean, I have had, a lot of that.
Yeah.
I there was a series of calls that actually almost broke me, very early in my career, very, very early in my career. I had been a paramedic for no more than, God, 3 or 4 months, maybe. The small organization that I worked for had 72-hour shifts. And And during this 72-hour period of time, I had three dead children in five
Oh,
calls. Yeah.
dude.
Three dead kids in five calls.
Ooh.
When I say five calls, I mean five pediatric calls. So I had five pediatric calls in the 72-hour shift. Three of the five children died either in front of me or at the hospital later. And I left. I didn't finish my 72-hour shift. I actually left in the middle of the shift and went home. I lived about an hour and a half away from where my station was. Went home, cried, drank everything that I had. And yeah, I mean, I was like, cool. Got done with my first fifth of Maker's Mark. Let's move on to the next one. And
Yuck.
yuck is correct. And I did not go back to work for about 2 weeks. Thought for sure that I was going to leave EMS forever. I was like, this is too heavy. Like, I can't deal with this. And at that time too, you know, I had a my daughter was probably three, and my son was like one. The oldest one was like one, and because now we have six, we got a bunch of those little shites now.
Yeah.
But but and two of the one of these five calls was a traffic accident, a small Honda Accord versus a truck, and in the Honda was a mom driver, dad in the passenger seat, and then a 3-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy in the back seat. Husband was the only one that survived the accident.
Ugh. Oof.
Yeah, yeah. The two children were alive when I got there, but they were dead within a couple hours.
Yeah, that's a rough accident, man.
Yeah, yeah. And that started the shift, and then it just got worse from there. So yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I have that rubber stamp on my forehead that says, you know, you're gonna get shit on your entire career.
Yeah. Yep.
But you know, I don't regret it at all, though. You know, I don't. There's no like, woe is me. I wish this didn't happen to me, because every single thing that happens to you in EMS, every single experience that you have, good, bad, or otherwise, makes you into the person that you are eventually, right? And so, unless you're looking at the mirror today and you say, I fucking hate everything about me and my entire life and my circumstance, you know, unless you say that, like, you can't regret anything that you've done or said or experienced because it made you the person that you are today. And so, if you like who you are today in this moment, don't regret shit. Like, they're all just experiences, you know, but they
Exactly.
molded you into who you are. So that's my take on it anyway.
This is so cliche, but my wife told me about, and I can't quote anything, but she told me the story about this guy who wanted a quote that would encompass, like, knowing that if you're in a shitty time, it's going to get better. But
Mm-hmm.
also, if you're having the best time of your life, right? It's going to end.
Yes.
And the quote was, "This too shall pass."
Yeah. Very,
And
it's
it
so true. Yeah.
oh, it was so profound. Like, I have goosebumps right now talking about it. Like that, I she told me that, and I was like, I am keeping that, because
Yeah.
that's, you have to remember that if you're in a bad time, it's going to go away. It's not
Mm-hmm.
going to last forever. And if you're having the best time of your life, that's also not going to last forever.
No, it will not. Bad things will happen to you, and amazingly good things will happen to you. It is what it is, and you should not want it any other way. Because unless
Yes.
shitty things have happened to you, you won't even know when something good happens to you because you have no point of reference.
Yes. And I love that so much. Like, it's definitely something to keep with you every day, you know?
Yeah.
It
No.
sucks right now, but it's not going to suck forever.
Yeah. No. And yeah, time does heal most wounds.
Yes, most.
Most. I
So,
didn't say time heals all wounds.
do you want to share one of your favorite stories?
Yes, I will share one of my favorite stories. And this seems like a weird favorite story,
Not at all.
but this was actually with the gorilla. And the reason I'm not saying his actual name is because I don't know if I actually was just talking to him earlier today. Him and I haven't worked together for 10 years, but him and I actually just talked to each other on the phone today. But and I should have asked him if he wanted me to use his name. But so me and we'll call him Mark. That is not his name. We were cruising around downtown. We were actually on our way from one post to another. We do like a system status back then. And so we get a call that was it wasn't toned out to a call. It was like a band wide or a system wide notification that a bystander had called on X and X intersection, stating that he had seen a male subject dragging a female subject into the bushes. And that was it.
That's so
And
vague.
so vague. And so we kind of look around and I'm like, we're there. We're fucking right here where this just got reported. So we start cruising around the block, and this block is really weird. And so like you can see it on the camera, but it's really weird. So you have this lower street, and then you have like a U-turn and it goes up the street. So there's kind of like a cliff face between these two road elevations. And so we're on the top, and then we cruise around down toward the bottom, and I'm looking out my passenger window in the ambulance, and he's looking out his driver's side window, and he all of a sudden like rips it off the road and slams the brakes on, and he doesn't actually say anything to me. He's just like, come on.
Oh,
And so I'm like, what the hell? And so I look up the hillside, and when I say hillside, I mean this is a cliff essentially, right? It is a like a few degrees off 90. And I look up, and almost all the way up at the top is this maybe 19-year-old little skinny blonde girl hanging by a necktie from a bush.
oh my
And
goodness.
there's a small little kind of outcropping where she was, and he had tied her, tied a necktie around her neck and pushed her, and she was hanging and she was limp. And so this seems like a bad story. It's not. And so uh, my partner starts just conquering this hill with his hands and feet. I mean, hands and feet. He is running up this like a wild animal. And I'm like, the fuck? And so I'm like trying to get up it, and I'm like slipping and like sliding down, and I'm like, how did you get up there? And I'm struggling at the bottom, and and I finally get about halfway up, and he's up there now, and he's taken the weight off, and so she's no longer being suspended by her neck. I am clearly not capable of being manly enough to get up there because I am like halfway up and I can't get up there. So this gargantuan fucking human that I work with, who's also, when he's not at work, he's like the gentlest person on the planet.
Yeah.
He puts her over his shoulder and grabs the necktie and snaps it. Not
Oh my goodness.
not breaks the branch. He rips this freaking silk necktie in half and detaches her from the tree. And then he starts to come down the hill with her. He's kind of sliding down the cliff with her over his shoulder until he gets to me. And in my mind, I'm like, well, I need to be a contributing member of this society. And so I'll help him down. I'll stay on the downhill side and support him, which is a joke because he weighed 310, 315. I was training for marathons at the time, and so I was like maybe 155 pounds, and which he would have just murdered me, right? So we get about 10 more feet down this hill, but I'm looking up the hill at him. I'm not looking down the hill at my feet, and I hit a little piece of a manzanita bush with my ankle. So I start to fall backwards, and I am going to fall backwards and get seriously injured.
Yes.
And he catches me by the chest of my uniform. And so he has this dead female on his shoulder, and he is grabbing me with his other hand, and I'm suspended like a baby with him holding the chest part of my uniform. And like that like Dwayne the Rock Johnson in a hero movie. He just looks me like dead in the eye, and there is no jokingness happening. He just goes, "I got you," and I just lost my shit. Like I laughed so hard when he said that. I just like lost it. It was just like the silliest, dumbest thing, and that story would not probably
Oh,
be amazing, but we got this girl down. At this point, remember, nobody even knew that we were there. Right? He
yeah.
didn't say like Shascom, we found her. He just got out and tore up this hill like a freaking animal. And so we get back down. I start compressions on this girl. I get the necktie off of her neck, and he calls, for everybody to come get us or to come help us. So fire department gets there. We get Rosk on this girl, and then 3 days later, when they were doing a sedation vacation in the ICU, she sat up and extubated herself, and her first words were, "Where the fuck am I?" So she also had amazingly good neurological status.
Sounds like it.
So super good outcome all around. And they found the shit bag that ended up hanging her. He had run into a grocery store across the street. They caught him on camera, and so she lived, and she completely fully recovered from this injury. But I just like in that moment, it was the funniest thing that I had like ever experienced in my life. I was like, I'm like in a movie right now. Like this guy looking at me as he saves me from falling down a cliffside. And he's just like, "I got you, bro." It was just, it was the best. And so that is my fondest memory of EMS.
That is absolutely fantastic. I wish I could have been there. Sounds so amazing.
Yeah.
That
Like, where's the film crew? Yeah.
I honestly probably would have done the same thing. I probably would have just started cracking up laughing
Yeah.
just because he said that.
And yeah, and a non-EMS person would not have done that because they're like, "Oh my God, you have like there's like a dead girl on his other shoulder." But yeah, it was in the moment there was nothing funnier for sure. Yeah. But
I'm sure that brought up some pretty awesome laughs afterwards, and I bet you guys just crack up about it every once in a while.
oh, there was not an EMS person in the county that did not know about that story afterwards. And his heroic life-saving voice when he caught me in midair as I was falling down a cliff. Yeah.
That is so, oh man, I wish I would have been there. That is
Yeah.
just the best story I've ever heard. Thank you for sharing that with me and for sharing it with everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I will text him and tell him if he thought it was annoying that 50 people knew that story. Now a lot more people are going to know that story.
Yes, just a little more.
Yeah.
So I want to give you the opportunity to kind of, if you want to share anything, I'll give you a few minutes to share, and then we'll work on closing up.
Sure. Yeah. Kind of a into like a Hot Ones episode where they like, "And what do you got going on in your life?"
That's right.
Um, so yeah, no, I mean, just finishing up my second book. My first book that I did, which was the Flight Medic's Guide to Mechanical Ventilation. That book did like amazingly well. We still sell, probably 12 or 1,500 copies a year, which is like amazing and awesome. And I'm so blessed. Like every day that people want to read the friggin' stuff that I decide to put down. It's truly, truly humbling that people trust me enough to listen to it and to kind of support us and support my family. I'm so deeply appreciative to everybody for that. But my second book is coming out. It's called The Flight Medic's Guide to Airway Management, and talks a lot about safe pre-oxygenation and airway management and airway interventions and different techniques that you can use to be successful when you're intubating. And so I'm hoping that you guys will give that one a try too. But
I have your first one, and I am very much looking forward to the second one.
good. Well, I really appreciate that. Yeah, I really, really appreciate that. It's taken me. It actually took me a lot longer to write this one than it did my first book, because I wanted it to encompass like a lot more. So it starts off really, really basic, but it really delves into a lot of the questions that people have, and just the importance of it. But the hardest part about this is that a lot of people think that they're really good at it already.
Yes.
And so I had to take some time in the book to really look at the numbers and maybe change a few minds about, I guess, their current practice. And so, well, hopefully it's received very well. But not it's definitely not meant to be an attack, but it's meant to be almost a call to action to continue to do better.
Yes, very eye-opening, which is good. We need it.
Yeah, but that's it. That's what I've got going on, and then just running the business, and couldn't be happier to say that I'm basically officially retired from
Yeah,
the
I
office.
don't blame. I'm super jealous, man. That's fantastic. What's your website, real quick?
Yeah, it's kaisercpr.com, which is just KISER CPR.com. So it's just Kisser with one S. And you'll find all of our reference material. You'll find the first book very, very soon. You'll find the second book. We make a lot of reference cards for vent management, lab interpretation, and then we're just releasing an airway management checklist as well as a CPAP and BiPAP card here in the next few weeks. And then, as you know, we're also an American Heart Association training site. So we teach about 10,000 students a year in all the AHA classes and everything like that.
That's fantastic, man. Sounds like you're doing good. And like you've said, you're in quite a successful position enough to retire from bedside. And that's huge. That is freaking huge, man. So
Yeah,
congratulations.
thank you.
Like I said, I'm looking forward to that second book. And then I want to also give you the chance to say your mantra before we close up.
Yes, absolutely. My mantra is the NASA mantra, right? Which, if you guys, are you familiar with the NASA
I am
mantra?
not.
So very, very quick story. So when the one of the Apollo rockets was getting ready to launch, one of the astronauts actually went up into a capsule door that was open in one of the rockets, and he found a technician that was in there, and he was, building something. He was kind of tinkering with a little wrench, and the astronaut was like, you guys are so amazing. Like, I just don't understand how you know how to build all these things. Like, I can fly it, I'm a pilot, but I just don't understand the technology that it goes to build one of these things. And this rocket engineer was like, I don't know how most of this stuff goes together either. That's not my job, right? My job is actually just this single system within this much larger rocket. But I can tell you one thing, I am an expert at that one piece of equipment that needs to be in here to make this thing function properly. And I can also promise you that this thing will not fail because of me. And that's my mantra. It will not fail because of me. And if you say that to yourself every day when you're feeling lazy and you don't want to crack open the book and you don't want to watch that video, but you know in your heart of hearts that you're not an expert at that disease and that child or that woman or that man or whatever it is, if you're not an expert at that, it can fail because of you. Don't let it fail because of you. And you'll be very, very good at what you do.
What an amazing thing to say, man. Super impressive. I appreciate you. Like I said, I told you earlier, you're speaking to the soul and you're definitely speaking from the soul, and it's really impressive. And you're doing a lot of good things. So thank you for the service that you're doing for, our community and for other people's services. It's making everybody better.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that. But I do really appreciate you having me on. It's actually so nice to get back into this kind of stuff. It's taken a little hiatus from this type of platform, and I really appreciate you having me on, and I really appreciate what you're doing too. This is something we don't talk about very often, especially in EMS, because we're an 8-year young, can't handle the heat type of industry, and that's not a good way to go about it. And so you're doing a really good thing, and I appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate it, man, and I hope you continue doing what you're doing, and don't forget about the podcast.
I won't.
We all
I'm
like listening,
sure.
so
Yeah. No, I appreciate that a bunch. Yeah. You have a wonderful rest of your day.
thanks, brother. You too. Be safe, okay?
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. Before we wrap up, we have a few important announcements to share with you. Firstly, we're excited to announce the launch of our brand new 911 Nonsense Facebook group page. It's a community where everyone can go to connect, share ideas, discuss topics from the show, and get all of the most recent updates about the podcast. We'd love to have you join us and be part of the conversation. Next, we want to ask you to rate and review our podcast on your preferred platform. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach a wider audience. By rating and reviewing the show, you'll be supporting us in a big way and helping others discover 911 nonsense. If you enjoy what we do and would like to support the podcast even further, we have a few options available. You can visit samspursuit.com to find the links to our 911 Nonsense merch page and our recently released Noon gear page. Every contribution, no matter the size, goes a long way in helping us continue to better the podcast. We know that not everyone is comfortable being on the podcast, but we still want to hear your stories and experiences. If you have a compelling story and would like to share it to be read by me in a future episode, please reach out to us via email at 911nonsense@gmail.com or through our website's contact section. If you choose to be anonymous, we'll make sure to respect your privacy while sharing your story in a way that resonates with our audience. Thank you again for tuning in. We truly appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more engaging content in the future. See you next week.